Okay, here we go. Lenny had killed Curly's wife last time, and he was taking the pup and he was getting out of there. It was bad enough as it was. Peered out between the cracks and toward the horseshoe game, and then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back with a half covering of hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door, circled, and flew out again. Around the last stall came the dog. Halfway to the packing case, where the puppies were, she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair arose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the planning and the discontent, the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty, simple. Her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and just sleeping very lightly. The curls, the tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were slightly parted. And as happens sometimes, a moment settles, and it hovers, and it remains for much, much more than a moment. And sound stopped, and movement stopped, for much, much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer, and from around the end of the last stall came old Candy's voice. "Lenny," he called. "Lenny, you out here? I've been figuring some more, and I tell you what we could do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped, and his body stiffened, and he rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped closer. "You ought to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her. "Oh, Jesus." He looked about helplessly, he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. The barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted. They chewed the straw of their bedding. They clashed the chains of their halters. And in a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Ah, Jesus!" He was down on his knees beside her, and he put his hand over her heart. And finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any ideas?" Candy was silent. "I should have knowed," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What are we going to do now, George? What are we going to do now?" George was a long time in answering. I guess we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta lock him up. We can't let him get away. Poor bastard would starve." He tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and they'll be nice to him. But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away, George. You don't know that, Curly. Curly gonna want to get him lynched. Curly gonna want to get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right. Curly will, and the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. And now Candy spoke his greatest fear. You and me, we can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me, we can go and live in that nice place, can't we, George? Can't we? But before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked at the hay. He knew. And George said softly, I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much that I got to thinking maybe we would. Then it's all off, Candy said sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, I'll work my month, and I'll take my $50, and I'll stay all night in some saloon, or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back, and I'll work another month, and I'll have $50 more. Candy said, he's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this. George still stared at Curly's wife. Lenny never done it in meanness. All the time he done bad things. He never done one of them mean. He straightened up and he looked back at Candy. Now listen, you gotta tell the guys, they gotta bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him. And then he said sharply, well, I ain't gonna let him hurt Lenny. Now listen, the guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunkhouse now, and then in a minute you come out and you tell the guys about her. I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that so the guys won't think I was in on it? Candy said, sure, George. Sure, I'll do that. Oh, okay. Okay, give me a couple minutes, and then you come running and you tell them like you just found her. I'm gonna go now. George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go, and he looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. You tramp, he said viciously. You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you messed things up, that you wasn't no good. Well, you ain't no good now. He sniveled and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused and he went on in the sing-song way that they always did, repeating the old words. And if there was a circus or a ball game, we'd have just went to her. We'd have said to hell with work and just went to her. Never had to ask nobody say so. And they'd have been a pig and chickens, and in the winter, a little fat stove, and the rain coming down, and us just sitting there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum and running feet. Men burst into the barn. Slim, Carlson, Young Wit, Curly, Crooks, keeping back out of attention. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it up. His black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall, and their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom, and they stopped and stood still and looked. And then Slim went quietly over to her and felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her spine. And then he stood up, and the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly suddenly came to life. I know who done it. That big guy done it. I know he done it. While everybody else was out pitching shoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going to go for my shotgun. I'm going to kill him myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, guys. And he ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger. And he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it all right. Her neck's bust. Lenny could have done that. George didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. His hat was so far down over his eyes, his forehead, that his eyes were covered. Slim went on, maybe like that time in weed he was telling me about? Again. George just nodded. Slim said, well, I guess we gotta get him. Where do you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south. We come from the north, so he would have went south. I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this out of meanness. Slim nodded. We might. If we could keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand, George, and suppose they do lock him up and strap him down, put him in a cage. That's no good, George. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running in. I stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold with anger now. All right, you guys. Stablebuck got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chances. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you going to Soledad, get a cop. Get Al Willits. He's deputy sheriff. Come on, let's go now. And then he turned suspiciously to George. You coming with us, fella? Yeah, I'll come, but listen, Curly, he's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He got Carlson's Luger. Of course we're going to shoot him. And George said weakly, maybe Carlson lost his gun. Nah, I seen it this morning, Carlson said. Nah, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife, and he said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going. I'm going to shoot the bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. Better stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us. So we don't think you had anything to do with this. George moved slowly after them. His feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. The sound of the men grew fainter, and the barn was darkening gradually. And in their stalls, the horses shifted their feet and rattled their halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay, and he covered his eyes with one arm. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabeline Mountains. The hilltops were rosy with the sun. But by the pool, among the molted sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisted its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent beak lanced down and plucked it by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while it still waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamores turned up their silver sides, and the brown dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. And as quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly, Lenny appeared in the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off downriver. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. And he knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. And when a little bird skidded over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up, and he strained toward the sound with his eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. When he was finished, he sat down on the bank with his side to the pool so he could watch the trail's entrance, and he embraced his knees and he laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. And Lenny said softly, "Nah, I didn't forget. You bet. Hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George gonna give me hell. George gonna wish he was alone and not have me bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountaintops. "I can go off in the hills and find a cave." And he continued sadly, "And never have no ketchup. But I don't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And then from out of Lenny's head there came a fat little old woman. She wore thick bull's-eye glasses. Okay, I wanted to stop before, but I gotta stop now. So Lenny is hallucinating. He's stressed. He's scared. The woman and the rabbit's coming. They're not real. They're just figments of Lenny's imagination. And then out of Lenny's head there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bull's-eye glasses and a huge gingham apron with pockets. She was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and she put her hands on her hips and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. "I told you and told you. I told you. Mind George. He's such a nice fella and gives everything to you, but you don't take no care. You do bad things." Then Lenny answered her, I tried and tried, Aunt Claire. Ma'am, I tried and tried. I couldn't help it." "You never give no thought to George," she went on in Lenny's voice. "He's been doing nice things for you all of the time, and when he got a piece of pie, you always got half or more than half. And if there was any ketchup, he'd give it all to you." I know, said Lenny miserably. I tried, Aunt Claire. Ma'am, I tried and tried." She interrupted him. "All the time he could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and went to a saloon. He could have sat in a pool room and played pool, but he got to take care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. I know, Aunt Clara. Ma'am, I'll go right off in the hills and I'll find a cave and I'll live there so I won't be no more trouble to George." "You say that," she said sharply. "You're always saying that. You know you ain't never going to do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time." Lenny said, "I might as well go away. George ain't going to let me tend no rabbits now." Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him. It waggled its ears, it crinkled its nose, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. "10 rabbits," it said scornfully. "You ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbits. You forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you do. And then what would George think?" "I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't. You ain't worth a greased jack pin. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it didn't do no good. And if you think George is gonna let you tend rabbits, you're crazier than usual. He ain't. He gonna beat the hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do." And now Lenny retorted belligerently, "He ain't neither. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I know George since, well, I forget when, but he ain't never raised a hand at me with no stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean." "Well, he's sick of you," said the rabbit. "He's gonna beat the hell out of you and then go away and leave you." "He won't," Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him, we travels together." But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, "He's gonna leave you. He's gonna leave you all alone. He's gonna leave you." Lenny put his hands over his ears. He ain't. He ain't. And then he cried, George! Oh, George! George! George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. And George said quietly, What the hell are you yelling about? Lenny got up on his knees. You ain't gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't. George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. No. I knowed it, Lenny cried. You ain't that kind. George was silent. Lenny said, George? Yeah. I done another bad thing. It don't make no difference, George said. And he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft, and from the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. And George turned his head and listened to the shouts. And Lenny said, George? Yeah. Hey, ain't you gonna give me hell? Give you hell? Sure, like you always done before. Like, if I didn't have you, I could take my $50. Jesus, Lenny. You can't remember nothing, but you remember every word I say. Well, ain't you gonna say it? George shook himself, and he said woodenly, If I was alone, I could live life so easy. His voice was monotonous. It had no emphasis. I could get a job and have no mess. And he stopped. Go on, said Leanne, and when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to a saloon. And he stopped again. Lenny looked at him eagerly. Go on, George. Ain't you gonna give me no more hell? No, said George. I can go away. I can go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. George shook himself again. No, Lenny, I want you to stay here with me. Lenny said craftily, Tell me like you done before. Tell you what, about the other guys and about us. And George said, guys like us got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it. And they ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about them. But not us. Lenny cried happily. Tell about us now. George was quiet for a moment. But not us. Because I got you. And I got you. We got each other, that's what. Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled, and the wind waves flowed up the green pool. And then the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. And George took off his hat, and he said shakily, Take off your hat, Lenny. The air feels fine. Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow and the valley were bluer, and the evening was coming fast, and on the wind the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. And Lenny said, Tell how it's gonna be. George had been listening to the distant sounds, and for a moment he was businesslike. I want you to look across the river, Lenny, and I'm gonna tell you like you can almost see it. Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool, up the darkening slopes and the mountains. We're going to get a little place, Lenny, George began. and he reached in his side pocket and he brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety and laid the hand and the gun on the ground behind Lenny's back. And he looked at the back of Lenny's head at the place where the spine and the skull were joined. And a man's voice called up the river, and another man's answered. "Go on," said Lenny. And George raised the gun, and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. Go on, how's it gonna be? We're gonna get a little place. We'll have a cow, said George, and we'll have maybe a pig and chickens, and down the flat we'll have a little piece of alfalfa. For the rabbits, Lenny shouted. For the rabbits, George repeated. No, I get to tend the rabbits. And you get to tend the rabbits, Lenny. Lenny giggled with happiness. And live off the fat of the land. Yeah. Lenny turned his head. No, Lenny. Lenny, I want you to look down across the river, like you can almost see the place. Lenny obeyed him, and George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now, and George turned and looked toward them. Go on, George, go on. When we gonna do it? We're gonna do it soon, Lenny. Me and you. You and me. And everybody's gonna be nice to you. And there ain't gonna be no more trouble, Lenny. And nobody's gonna hurt nobody or steal from them. And Lenny said, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, Lenny. I ain't mad, and I ain't never been mad, and I ain't mad now, and that's the thing I want you to know. The voices came close now, and George raised the gun, and he listened to the voices. And Lenny begged, Let's do it now. Let's go that place now, George. Sure, Lenny. Right now. We gotta, Lenny. And George raised the gun and steadied it. And he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. And his hand shook violently, but he set his face, and his hand steadied. And he pulled the trigger. And the crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. And Lenny jarred, and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay there without quivering. George shivered, and he looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him back on the bank near the pile of old ash. And the brush seemed filled with cries, with the sounds of running feet. Slim's voice shouted, George! George, where are you at, George? But George sat stiffly on the bank, and he looked at the right hand that had thrown the gun away. And the group burst into the clearing, and Curly was ahead, and he saw Lenny lying on the sand. Got him, by God! He went over and he looked down at Lenny, and then he looked back at George. Right in the back of the head, he said softly. Slim came directly to George, and he sat down beside him, sat very close to him. Never you mind, George. You had to do it. Carlson was standing over George. How'd you do it? He asked. I just done it. George said tiredly. Did he have my gun? Yeah. He had your gun. And you got it away from him, and you took it and you killed him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's how it was. George's voice was almost a whisper, and he looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. Come on, George. Me and you, we'll go get a drink. George let himself be helped to his feet. Yeah, a drink. And Slim said, You had it, George. You had to. Come on. And he led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. And Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, "Now what the hell you suppose is eating those two guys?" And that's it. And now George is just like everybody else. He's all alone. He's going to find out if it's really nicer living life without Lenny. But I think he'll find that, like all of us, life's pretty hard as it is, and it's a lot tougher when you're all alone. Life's a lot easier if you have somebody else to go through it with. Somebody else. I'm really sorry that I wasn't here to see your faces. I've never done this, read it like this before, but I'll definitely want to talk to you about it tomorrow when I get back. You can talk to your sub about it, but I'm going to want to know what you thought. Thanks.